Good evening. My name is Al Nofi. I'm an author and game designer, retired teacher, living in Brooklyn, New York, and I do Civil War. And in the course of my doing Civil War, I occasionally came across references to Fred Grant, the 12-year-old son of Ulysses S. Grant, being with his father on campaign from time to time. And I just thought it was, kind of a curious thing. Maybe he was working as his dad's sort of orderly or something, or just to keep him company, far from home and stuff, since the Grants are well known to be a close-knit family. And then one day I'm reading a recent book, well, recent, about 2.5 years ago. I'm reading a new book on Gettysburg, a new book on Vicksburg, and there's an anecdote in it it's quite interesting, and it's attributed to Fred Grant. So I looked up the footnote and I pursued the material. It was the proceedings of a meeting of the Army of the Tennessee, done in the 1880s. And it turns out that it wasn't just an anecdote, but it was several thousand words by Fred Grant recounting his adventures during 3 months with the Army. So I looked up some more, and it turned out he'd written quite a number of little memoirs of his 3 months with the Army, speaking before the Society of the Army of the Tennessee, but also other veterans groups. And then in interviews, he would make a couple of comments. And I eventually ran down about 12 different versions of his little speech, most of which were 4,000 words, 5,000 words, and then found that he had actually done 18,000 words for the National Tribune, which was in fact, it was the prominent veterans magazine from a few years after the war until the 1920s. And I read that, and it had a lot of material that wasn't in any of the other little essays. And I thought to myself, this would be a very useful tool for people doing research. And that's how I came about writing a book about Fred. All right. This is the story of a 12-year-old in the Vicksburg campaign. And it's a great story for 12-year-olds and for the rest of us too. If you're 12, you're going to love this. This is Fred. It's taken when he's about 15. He's wearing a school uniform. The earliest picture, apparently, of Fred that I could find was this one. Apparently, there are no others. The Grant family arrived in the U.S., well, in what became the U.S. in the 1630s, and they all served in the militia, and a couple of them had some notable records. Fred's great-great-grandfather, Noah Grant, was a captain of the Connecticut militia, a ranger, one of Rogers' Rangers in the French and Indian War, and he was cited for extraordinary services and good conduct. And he disappeared while scouting near Fort William Henry on September 20th, 1756, along with his younger brother. He just went out one day near, this is in upstate New York, not far from Fort Ticonderoga, and just disappeared. Fred's great-grandfather, Noah Grant, again, another Noah Grant, family tradition says that he took part in the Boston Tea Party, but more firmly in 1776, he enlisted in Bedell's New Hampshire Regiment and served in the invasion of Canada under the command of course, Benedict Arnold, and rose to captain by the end of the Revolutionary War. And of course, the most distinguished military career and soldier in the family is Papa Grant, we might call him, who had gone to West Point. He served in the war with Mexico. Although he was the quartermaster of the 4th Infantry Regiment, he managed to get himself into several of the battles. So he earned 2 brevets, He was subsequently, meanwhile, after the war, he got married. He married a young woman from a slaveholding family, actually, who was the sister of his roommate, his West Point roommate. Coming back from, he tried various enterprises and didn't succeed. He was basically thrown out of the army. He resigned under duress because he was posted to a desolate place in far northern California and is reported to have indulged in booze too much. Indulging in booze too much was not exactly unknown in the army, since the army on the frontier, even at the height of the so-called Indian Wars, most of the troops on the frontier did nothing. It was boring duty that went on endlessly. Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father, spent 22 years on the frontier and never heard a shot fired in England. So he went back to his wife. They were already raising children. He tried various jobs, not succeeding. Nevertheless, he lived on the verge of poverty, despite which his father-in-law gave him a slave, and he sold them. He did not sell the man. He gave the man his freedom. So there's some strength of character there. Okay, so these are the Grants. Over here is Mrs. Grant, Fred, Nellie, the general. This is U.S. Grant. This is Jesse, and then this is U.S. Grant Jr. The interesting thing about this picture is that Fred and his mother are looking off to this side of the screen, and everybody else is looking at the camera. I have no idea what that curious thing. Anyway, so Fred goes to war. Very beginning of the war, his father is he's not reinstated in the army. He is activated in the Illinois National Guard, in effect, the Illinois militia. And he helps to raise regiments. Eventually, he is accepted as the volunteer colonel. He was accepted in the volunteer army as colonel of the 21st Illinois, which is training at Camp Yates, which is near Springfield. And Fred spent about 3-4 weeks with his dad, having a good time. The troops gave him a little uniform. He rode around the establishment, the base. He had his own horse, and everybody spoiled him. He was a pet. On July 12th, the regiment was ordered basically to the front. There was danger of Confederate raids across the Mississippi from Missouri. And so Grant, and when I say Grant here, I will mean Papa Grant, not Fred, sent him home by steamer on the river. And he wrote a letter to Mrs. Grant. So the steamer takes a little while chugging along. Mrs. Grant sends a letter back, a telegraph back, apparently, to tell him that he's on his way. So before Fred gets home, this happens. Fred was delayed in getting home because he missed his train connection in Springfield. He missed his train connection and ended up walking 18 miles before he got home. So before Fred gets home, Mrs. Grant says this: "Do not send him home. Alexander was not older when he accompanied Philip." Now, this is the mother of a 12-year-old boy, and she's basically saying that he should stay with his father going to war. The Alexander referred to, of course, is Alexander the Great, who was not 12 when he first went to war. He was 16. But Mrs. Grant was a woman of she was a tough woman. Okay, so in the next few months, Fred and the family, they stay in school. He's at school in Kentucky, actually, which leads to some trouble later in the war. But occasionally they visit the army, either with Fred sometimes goes with his mother and his brothers and sister, and sometimes with his grandfather. And in fact, at one point, Fred suggests that he comes with him. For example, he's at Fort Henry after it's captured. And then they go home. He's at Fort Henry with his grandfather. And then they go home. And of course, what follows is Fort Donelson. And Grant writes in a letter back home that he wished that Fred had stayed to see the fighting for Fort Donelson. So Grant keeps suggesting that Fred come visit. And finally, on March 5th, 1863, when Grant is getting ready for his final push on Vicksburg, he writes to Julia and says, I want Fred to come and stay with me. All right. A few days later, Mrs. Grant puts Fred on a steamboat from Memphis. Okay. Now, this is not a very good map, but it gives you an idea somewhat of the nature of the Mississippi River. You can see the extraordinarily complex curves here. Grant had tried to come down, attack Mississippi from the north, couldn't do it. He tried to go through these bayous and whatnot, couldn't do it. He was trying to get on hard, dry land here. So they're coming down the river. He's in a tin clad. This is not the tin clad he was in. You can sort of see these lines. They're not very clear, but you can see their lines. Those are railroad tracks. A tin clad is basically just an ordinary wooden steamer armored with railroad tracks and boilerplate, backed by cotton bales and heavy timbers and whatnot. Even did some process of compressing the cotton bales so that instead of something that was about 4.5 or 5 feet wide, it would be about a few inches thick after they finished mashing the cotton. So he's on one of these. He's on the river, and as we see here, there's a place called Greenville. It's on a bluff above the river at a hairpin turn, a number of miles north of Vicksburg. And occasionally, Confederate troops would set up a battery there, as is here. So someone gives the alarm, the enemy, and Fred says, I saw a coil of rope upon the cabin deck and proceeded to climb into the hole in the center of the coil, deeming myself safe refuge. Here's Fred in the coil of rope, and one of the ship's officers, as they finished passing the battery, telling him, see here, Sonny, if them rebels had fired at us and hit our boiler, you would have gone straight up through the hurricane deck, and there would not have been a piece of you left to send home to your mama. This is a good thing for a 12-year-old to hear. The drawing is from the 1877 18,000-word essay that Fred wrote. There are a bunch of these drawings. They are very bad quality, even the original. So I apologize for the quality, but they're perfect to illustrate some of Fred's adventures. So Fred gets to Vicksburg, right? Joins his father at Young's Point, Louisiana, March 29th. Fred has a lot to say about the nature of the camps, the mud. This is the Mississippi River, of course, He stays there over the next 3 months. He roams freely through the army. He doesn't see his father for days on end. He hangs out with the troops, shares their rations, witnesses the battles, and so forth. He's hungry sometimes. He's alone, frequently on the flyer, sleeping where he will, so on. Buys souvenirs. One day they came upon an abandoned plantation house, and he went in and he found the Bible for children, an illustrated children's Bible. They had those things in those days. So he takes it and he writes in it from Fred Grant to his sister Nellie. Well, he eventually loses the Bible. In 1961, during the Civil War centennial, the Bible was returned to the Grant family. Someone had found it. It's amazing. It's one of his souvenirs that he picked up. He also meets some of the most distinguished Americans, as we'll see. And he also gets dysentery and some other exciting conditions. All right. Admiral Porter. This is Admiral Porter, tough-looking sea dog. He had a wicked sense of humor, a great sense of humor, and he wrote two books about the Civil War. The first was called The Naval History of the Civil War, which is the most extraordinarily detailed and boring book. And then he wrote Anecdotes and Incidents of the Civil War, which will have you rolling on the floor. Okay, so Porter is visiting with General Grant. They're talking about how they're gonna, what they're gonna do. So, and this visit, Porter sends Fred on a tour of the ship with one of the officers, and the conversation that follows apparently is when Grant tells Porter, asks Porter, if you can run the batteries at Vicksburg, we can move the army overland on the Mississippi side, cross the river below Vicksburg, get on hard ground, and then we can capture the city. So this is a moment, Fred doesn't know it, but this important decision is made. All right. Now, while they're on the ship, the Union repeating gun, it's an early machine gun, mechanical gun, I guess would be the better way of saying it. As I say, an early machine gun. It's a precursor of the Gatling gun. What Dr. Gatling does is he realizes that one barrel is not enough. So he then figures out that if we had a multi-barrel gun and so on. A misfire sends a piece of metal into General Grant's thumb, and Fred tells us that it troubled the general for several days. This is where Fred's memoir becomes extraordinarily valuable, because there are a number of things in the memoir that are like this. This incident is not mentioned in any book about Grant that I have ever seen. It may be out there somewhere, but I went through several dozen biographies of Grant and accounts of the Vicksburg campaign, and none mentioned that he had been, in effect, wounded during the action. Even the two-volume medical history of the Union and Confederate generals doesn't mention this. So that's something to think about. Lots of amusing things happen. They're out riding with the staff, and they come to a little muddy creek. And of course, General Grant, being a superb horseman, leaps over, and he is immediately followed by everybody. But Rawlins, who's his chief of staff, his horse doesn't quite make it. Horse sort of plops into the mud. Rawlins jumps out, and the horse starts rolling around in the mud, and everybody's laughing. And someone yells out, "Rawlins, every turn makes you $100 richer." Right? In fact, Rawlins is stopping people from trying to get the horse under control. Well, if you're mystified, I certainly was when I saw this for the first time. It turns out a little bit of country lore. A good friend of mine grew up on a farm in Iowa in the 20s and 30s. There was a sort of folk belief that if an animal did something like this, that horse was having fun. It meant that he was a good horse, reliable and good heart and so on. And that's why the joke is that, the $100 every time he rolls around. In fact, at the end of when the horse finally gets out of the mud, Grant says to Rawlins, "Oh, horse just made you $1,200, Okay. All right, this is the batteries at Vicksburg. We're running the batteries at Vicksburg. Fred goes into the details of the preparations fairly well. He talks about, lashing barges to one side of the ships to improve their resistance to the Confederate gunnery. He even talks about the fact that the crews of the ships refused to run the batteries. The only people in the crews that he says, were willing to go were the engineers. And so they went through the Army recruiting men who had some experience with steamboats. And there was one Missouri regiment, I think it was the 7th Missouri, that volunteered en masse. One soldier saying he'd much rather go by boat downriver than have to march anymore. So he witnesses the event, and he makes this great description. Um, Suddenly, a rocket went up from the shore. Then a cannon burst forth from Warrenton, uh, and a shot passed directly in front of our boat. We stopped. They were watching from a boat, just off the side. Passed directly in front of our boat. We stopped. Flames sprang lurid from a house at DeSoto, which is one of the towns along the shore. The Confederates started burning the houses along the shore so that they could see the gunboats coming down the river. The water was illumined as by day's brightest sun. There in front of us, steaming down the river, were 6 gunboats, which looked to me like great black turtles, followed closely by 3 fragile transports moving directly toward the batteries of the doomed city. Great description. Fred doesn't tell you that accompanying him, sitting in the boat with his dad, is his mother, his 2 brothers, and his sister, along with several notable generals, 2 of whom are, taking turns bouncing his baby brother on their knee because the firing has got the kid terrified. Mrs. Grant, soon all the Confederate, no, this is still Fred. Soon all the Confederate guns on the hills and the riverfront opened up, firing on our little fleet, which went slowly onward. Presently, the Benton came to the turn of the river, and a broadside sent from her at the batteries of the enemy. The boat following came into action. In less than 10 minutes, all 6 of our vessels were in the battle, and the scene became grand and terrible to me. That was Mrs. Grant. That is Mrs. Grant, yes. Now back to Fred. Steaming up very near the Vicksburg shore, our boats poured their shot and shell in the city while the gunboats were thus engaged. The transports passed by, keeping close to the Louisiana shore. Suddenly, one of the 3 stopped. A flame shot up from her side. She began to reel and turn in an eddy. This boat was the Henry Clay and had been set on fire by a shot from the Warrenton batteries, burning and destroyed by the water's edge. You can read this yourself, but I'll talk. Now, what Grant has done here, what Fred has done, is, as he says in the memoir, he wrote it from memory. He didn't look up anything. He is known to have kept a diary while he was with his father's army, but we don't know if he consulted it, and we don't even know if it survived because it certainly doesn't exist today. So what he has done here is he has taken the 2 runnings of the batteries that occurred several days apart. The first time going down were the gunboats. And it turned out that despite heavy fire from the Confederates, they took relatively little damage. The second batch that went down were the transports. They came down about 3 days later. And although they were also prepared, they took very little damage except for the Henry Clay. There are a few mistakes that Fred makes like this. He gets people's names wrong all the time. This is the ship him and his family were on watching the events. It was just a river transport, and went back to civilian service after the war, and burned in a fire. This is Mrs. Grant. I'm sorry. Indeed, it was a grand sight. The batteries of Vicksburg poured shot and shell upon the broadsides, on the heads of our devoted little fleet, but Porter was there, thank heaven, to return broadside for broadside. The next few days, Grant is getting the army. The army has been marching down while this transports and the gunboats are moving. The army has been marching down through the mud and whatnot on the west side of the river, and Grant, has to decide where we're going to land on the east side of the river. So there's a town called Grand Gulf. It's a river port, and it would be a good place to land. But they don't know how heavily defended it is. So Porter brings the fleet up, and they start shelling the port, and firing happens back and forth. And what a sight met my horrified gaze as he boards. After the firing, the fleet comes back, and the Benton is there, and him and his dad go aboard the Benton. Probably the others of our party were more accustomed to such scenes than I, for I was sickened at the scene before me. The deck was covered with blood and pieces of flesh. Several dead men, torn and lacerated, lay about us. Some of the gunners were still bleeding, wounded, with still bleeding wounds, were standing firmly by their guns. This is a 12-year-old kid, remember. And you can see the engraving, attempts to give you an idea. There's a couple of bodies lying around and whatnot. Admiral Porter had struck in the back of the head. He's very enthusiastic, despite the fact that his face is ashy and whatnot. And he's in great pain, and he's using his sword as a cane. And he's talking with Grant. And they agree that you cannot cross the river at Grand Gulf. All right, so at the end of the talk with Grant, Porter turns to Fred and asks, Porter asked if I did not wish to remain with him during the next engagement, saying he would like to have me, as I might take the place of a gunner he had just lost. So Fred says, the scene around me dampened any ardor I might have possessed for naval glory, so that I replied, trembling lest my father should contradict my statement, that I did not believe my papa would leave me there, even if I wished to stay with the admiral. In a different version of the thing, he basically says he was scared as heck that his father would agree. They go back to the west side of the river, and at Grant's camp, they're interviewing people, and a black man comes up, and he's apparently a Union spy. And he tells Grant that the best place to land is at a place called Bruinsburg, which is just a little further down. This map is not very good, except to show the massive, the rough movements. But there's the river, of course. Here is Grand Gulf. Here is Bruinsburg. The black man is not identified. Now, this is not unusual in the Civil War. The black people, free, slave, and runaway, were enormously valuable sources of intelligence to the Union forces for several reasons. Firstly, of course, because they frequently had intimate knowledge of the nature of the Confederate defenses, since they had worked on them, or they were present when they were being built. Also, the habit of slavery throughout history is that eventually the slaves become invisible. You don't notice them unless they're doing something wrong. So people talk in front of slaves. So they are frequently present when generals are, talking about stuff, but you never see someone recording the name of one of these informants, because they're worried that retaliation might happen. So what you do get is phrases intended to assure you that the person was reliable, like black dispatches or intelligent contraband, which I actually saw someone once say was a put down. It wasn't a put down. It was an attempt to protect this man from retaliation. And it turns out that at Bruinsburg, nothing's happening. There's no, they land and there's no fighting, because the Confederates still assume he's going to be at Grand Gulf. Okay, so the army begins landing, and Grant's first move is against Grand Gulf from the land side. Fred is ordered to stay in his gunboat on the river, far from danger. So, of course, being a 12-year-old, he finagles his way on land, then manages to finagle his way to find a horse. Although, as you can see, although the picture isn't very good, the horse is not exactly the finest specimen of the equine race. All right. Fred proceeds forward and eventually finds his father and hides behind a tree for a while because he's afraid his father will scold him. But then someone spots him, and turns out his father is happy to see him. He's not going to see his dad too much because this is from the time they land at Bruinsburg to the time they close up, up to Vicksburg and lay it under siege, is Grant will fight 5 battles in about 2 weeks. And 4 of those battles will be in the last 4 or 5 days of the 2 weeks. So Grant is quite busy. And Fred is there behind the army, hanging out. He's walking along the road, this is a good example. He's walking along the road by himself, and he's sitting at the roadside, and one of his father's orderlies happens to pass by and says, "Oh, hey, kid, what's the matter? So I'm tired, I'm hungry." So the orderly makes him a little, takes his unsaddles his horse, makes a little bed for the kid, feeds him, lets him sleep it off, and then next morning they head out. You can see here another curious factoid of the campaign. Fred hitches a ride with a Grand supply train. And notice the mismatch here, that one of these mules is much bigger than the other. This is not the only mismatch in the logistical train. Here we've got another example. In every book I've ever read about Vicksburg, I've never encountered one that mentioned that Grant's supply train was completely improvised. When he landed at Grand Gulf, he landed troops and artillery. And then they began to round up wagons, all sorts of wagons. This looks like a stagecoach. And it's being drawn by an ox and a mule. He describes a cotton wagon. Cotton wagon is basically just a big box loaded with supplies, being drawn by two mules and an ox and a horse, or one of the most impressive logistical feats of the war. Okay, now Fred is hanging out. This is Fred and his friend Pony. Pony was apparently a very young soldier on his dad's headquarters detail, because they get into a lot of trouble together. At one point, they decide they're going to steal some pigeons. They're hungry, so they figure they'll steal some squaw pigeon. As they head towards the building, Confederate artillery starts firing, and here they are under fire. On another occasion, they're walking and they're riding, and they come past a farmhouse, and there's like 5 or 6 horses outside the farmhouse. And one of them says, "Let's steal the horses." That's why I say, Fred is 12, the other guy is probably only 16 or 17. So they think about, yeah, let's steal horses. But wait a minute, they probably belong to the Rebs who are inside. Why don't we capture the Rebs? So they agree to that, and then they start riding towards it and galloping towards it, actually. And Fred suddenly thinks, oh my God, suppose the Rebs capture us. Well, as it turns out, just as they got to the farmhouse, the guys inside came out, and they were all wearing blue uniforms, so they were lucky. Here's his father on the fire. This incident, during one of the battles, they're riding with his father and his staff, and the Confederates are retreating. And suddenly someone fires on the staff. So everybody starts ducking for cover, except Grant. He starts riding towards the firing. And of course, then everybody then proceeds with Grant to follow Grant, including Fred, who mentions, this is the only time he does, he mentions that he actually has a pistol. So here he is, he's 12 years old, he's wearing a Union uniform, to which the troops have sewn captain stripes because they think it's a great joke. And he's taking part in an advance again under fire, although in fact an engagement didn't result because some regiments came up and pursued the Rebs. All right. They finally push up against Vicksburg, and of course, Grant makes two efforts to storm the city. The first of which is perhaps reasonable. The second, he knew in retrospect that it was not. So during the fighting, one of the regiments that's made a little lodgment in the wall runs out of ammunition, and they send their drummer boy back, and he's wounded. As you can see in this illustration, he's rather fanciful, perhaps. And he shouts out that his regiment needs ammo, and then Grant orders him taken care of, and they carry him off. The kid shouts, "Caliber 58, caliber 58." All right, this is the young man, and Fred says, "I went to my father this moment and found to my surprise that his eyes were suffused with tears of sympathy for the brave boy." All right, this is Orion Perseus Howe. He was a drummer in Company C, 55th Illinois, and he was awarded a Medal of Honor eventually. His father was the chief musician of the regiment, and his younger brother was also a drummer in the regiment. It's a good spot to talk about children in the Army. A recent book has demonstrated that perhaps as many as 20% of the troops in the Union Army were under 18. Previously, the figure was thought to be maybe 2 or 3%. But of course, there were drummer boys in the Army, and occasionally, at least once, a drummer girl, actually. These underage soldiers and these drummer boys were in a regiment. And the difference between them and Grant was that they had someone to look after them. Fred had no one to look after him. He was frequently not with his father. He went hungry quite often, as we've already mentioned. One night, very chilly night, he's walking along a road and he sees a building, and the porch is full of soldiers sleeping, Union soldiers. So he crawls between two and he elbows one of them, and it turns out to be a colonel, and the colonel sort of, makes room for him and so on. But Fred is still cold, so he goes inside the house, and there's some guy sleeping on a bed. He crawls between them, wakes up in the morning. It's two black fear hands, so it's all by himself. During the siege of Vicksburg, people are coming down to visit the front. So this gentleman comes to visit his friends. He's from Missouri, and he visits one of the Missouri regiments, and he wants a souvenir. So they're talking back and forth, and somebody says, "Well, why don't you put your hat up and get, the Revs will surely shoot at it." So he puts his hat up. Unfortunately, he puts his hat up in his hand. As you can see in the picture here, he gets a bullet through his hand. So between the people sympathizing with him and everybody else saying, "Hey, look, you got this great souvenir." I suppose the guy went home and in later life maybe told wonderful stories about his adventures during the Vicksburg campaign. All right, during the siege, there's a lot of back and forth because remember, Missouri, which is right across the river, is a split state. It's a loyal border state. Missouri sends far more troops to the Union than the Confederacy, but both armies have Missouri troops in it. And during the siege, or lulls in the siege at night, it was not unusual for the troops to swap information or talk about, "Hey, your sister-in-law just got married," that sort of thing. And the normal swap was coffee for tobacco, which happened throughout the war. But they also swapped newspapers. And although Grant was advised by some officers to stop this process, he allowed it because the troops could get information, not necessarily reliable. But, for example, the Confederate newspapers would print what they thought was happening, and that could be of some value to him. Now, while Fred is there, General Lorenzo Thomas arrives. And General Thomas is the adjutant general of the Army, and he has a second hat as chief of recruiting for the U.S. colored troops, and he's in Louisiana to organize black regiments. He's actually quite good at it, and he develops a very good process. Um, able-bodied men, they see able-bodied men want to join, and mostly they do. He also organizes plantations where the now freed people can work for pay, and they're managed by the army, although they're still owned by the slave owner. Remember, slavery is still legal. They technically have not been emancipated in some cases. Other cases they are, but they have to make a living so they can work for their former master under the army's supervision. And it's they actually, some of them go on strike, and the strikes are settled by army arbitrators, for more pay and so on. This is a little funny encounter he has. Someone asked this man, "Why haven't you joined the army yet?" And he says, "Well, this general over here wants me to join him, and this guy wants me to join him, and this guy wants to join his regiment, and I don't know which one to decide." Okay. Now, during the siege, Grant has outposts on the west side of the river to cover the river. And one of them is a place called Milliken's Bend, just a few miles away from Vicksburg. And on June 6th, the Confederates attacked about not quite 2,000 Union troops there. About 200 of them are veterans of a white regiment. The rest of them are all new recruits. I mean, most of them haven't even been in the army a week. A few of them have been in the army 3-4 weeks. But a ferocious fight ensues. Runs like 9 hours from the time the Confederates attack on the 6th until the wee hours of the 7th. And then both sides sort of regroup. And in the next morning, 2 gunboats show up to support the defenders, and the defenders attack with the bayonet and drive off the Confederates. Now, the defenders still lose heavily. The actual number of casualties is not known because a lot of men just disappeared. They are fighting in mud and by the Mississippi and so on. And of course, anyone taken prisoner was either murdered and his body dumped in the river, or was sent off to be sold as a slave. And in fact, at the end of the war, there were some men working on plantations in Texas who had been prisoners taken, not just at Milliken's Bend, but other places. And some of them, it was months before they were discovered because it was Texas and there were people who didn't care to abide by the law. Okay. Now, Fred writes this about the engagement. This was the first engagement of any consequence fought by colored troops and had a very good effect upon the army, inasmuch as it proved that the Negroes would fight and help to liberate themselves. Some years after this memoir was published, it was reprinted in the Confederate Veteran. I guess it was kind of, a reconciliation kind of thing. Except that Fred's references to black troops and to the Battle of Milliken's Bend and to the fact that, quote, the Negroes would fight and help to liberate themselves was not included in the reprint, which tells you all you want to know if anybody asks why the war was fought. They're still selling the states' rights argument and the tariff. Okay. Now he gives us a little catalog of the officers, and it's kind of interesting. Admiral Porter, always ready to cooperate with the commanders in the army. Yeah, if you remember Lincoln's comment about the Navy, he called it Uncle Sam's webbed feet. Wherever you find a creek or a bayou or a little damp ground, you will find the fleet. Admiral Porter, who goes on to become a major reformer in the Navy. John Logan, John Logan, he idolized John Logan. He's several good things about John Logan. His relationship with Logan was excellent. He, at one point, in this case of this picture, this illustrates a moment where during the Confederates are retreating, and there's some Confederate troops that are still sort of in battle line. And Logan says to Fred, "Come on, boy, I'll show you the prettiest fight you ever saw." And he moves up, he begins to move up with a couple of regiments, and and the rebels run away. This is Logan. He was probably the best amateur soldier of the war. I know Chamberlain gets his kudos, but that's because Chamberlain was at Gettysburg. All right, McClernand. General McClernand was a political general. There's a very amusing anecdote about the fact that there was this theory, which still exists, of course, that anybody can do anything, and experts are not, they don't know what they're talking about. Well, this was McClernand. He didn't think much of being of the military profession. When he first showed up at Cairo, Illinois, because he was appointed the district commander, he didn't bother taking command. He just hung around. At no point did he say, "All right, I am now the commanding officer," which is the procedure that has to happen, And this went on for several days until somebody pointed it out. He was also a very political general. He, at one point, he tried to take Grant's job, basically. Grant had to handle him with considerable delicacy since he was a war Democrat, and had a lot of backing. Grant would eventually relieve him. Lincoln would give him a command on the Gulf Coast, which was a lot of prestige and no responsibility, which was good. Oh, his wife, he had just gotten married. His wife was also on the gunboat with them, watching the bombardment. General Grant regarded General McPherson as the most promising officer of his age in the Army. He was only 35. And he said that in the death of McPherson, he had lost one of his best friends and the country one of its ablest defenders. The man's name is McPherson. They pronounced things a little differently back then. And we often miss this. It was not President Buchanan, it was President Buchanan, for example. There is no fear in McPherson. And there he is. He was engaged to be married, and his future wife never married. This was not unusual at the time of the Civil War. Was it Victorian romanticism and maybe some practical consequences of misbehavior. Although it was the Victorian era, premarital relationships among engaged people were not necessarily unknown. So that's probably one reason why women engaged to guys who got killed never married again. Sherman, of course, he thought Sherman was a brilliant officer, as we see here. And here's Sherman, this typical picture of Sherman. Sherman once made a comment about Grant when someone said that Sherman was smarter than Grant. And Sherman said, "Yes, I know I'm smarter than Grant, but he comes up with things I never thought of." He's referring to things like going down the Mississippi, running the gunboats down the Mississippi. Towards the end of the siege, Fred is very ill. He got nicked by a musket ball at the Battle of Big Black River, which he tells a funny story about. He says he was hit, he fell down, and he starts shouting, "I'm killed." And a general, I think it was Lago, comes up to him, rolls him over, and Fred writes, I guess he assumed I didn't know what I was talking about, looks at him and says, "No, you're fine, kid, come on." It was a small scratch, but he neglected it and it became infected. He also got dysentery and probably had malaria. Most of the Army had malaria. So he was spending most of his time in his father's quarters for the last couple of weeks of the siege. And so here he is sitting in his father's headquarters. There'd already been a preliminary discussion, when his father receives the message that Vicksburg has surrendered. So he's the first person to know about it. He follows his father out and they have a talk. The group of officers, um, they, they're all there. They split up into three groups. A couple of the generals from both sides wander off in one direction so they can talk. The lesser ranking officers in another. And General Grant and General Pemberton sit down and talk. Now, Pemberton is usually regarded as incompetent. Part of that is because he was a Northerner who married into a slaveholding family and joined the Confederacy. In fact, he was always under suspicion in the Confederacy. The fact that he didn't do well during this campaign should not necessarily be attributed to incompetence. He was also bombarded by contrary instructions from Joe Johnston, who was technically his superior, and President Davis. And during the conduct of the siege itself, he was very energetic. Vicksburg held out for 49 days. People were literally, at the point of starvation. There's some irony in this meeting. At the end of the Mexican War, Grant, as I had said, was the quartermaster of the 4th Infantry. And Pemberton was on, they were both lieutenants. Pemberton was on General Scott's staff. General Scott, of course, possibly, he's up there with Grant as the best American soldier in the 19th century. He, at the end of the war, General Scott writes a commendation for Grant because he's done this extraordinary thing. He didn't have to go into any battles. He stayed back there with the mules and the wagons and make sure that the guys had beans and bullets. So Scott writes a commendation and delivers it to Grant by the hand of Pemberton. So here's, Grant and Pemberton talking over surrender terms. Okay. Afterwards, all right, the city surrenders, and Fred has some interesting comments about the reception. Everywhere they went, the enslaved people quite literally thought the army had come just to free them. And some little plantations that they visited, the people threw a party. In Vicksburg, it was a mixed reception. Some people were very icy about it. He recounts to a point where his father asks someone, there's a house, and he asks someone if he could have a glass of water, and nobody answers. And so finally someone says, you might find one inside, But they settle in the town, and they settled in a house of a very rich family, a man named Lum. Big house, 3-story house. Grant occupied the ground floor, and Mrs. Grant came down by steamboat and whatnot. They stayed there for a few days. And it turns out that the Lum family had 2 daughters, one of whom apparently Fred got a little soft, a little crush on because he allowed her to ride his horse. One of the guardian, not the guardian, the nanny for the children, the Lum family nanny, turned out to be a Northern woman. And she ended up marrying General Rawlins, the guy with the horse. So they had a good time. They were very good, close friends. And the friendship with the Lum family lasted until Grant's death. They exchanged letters occasionally and All right. So, some days after the surrender, Fred goes home and he's in a hospital for a while. He could easily have died. Doesn't see his father again until Chattanooga. The family visits him at Chattanooga, then sees him occasionally on other visits. then at the beginning of 64, Fred gets very ill. Now, this is after the Battle of Chattanooga, of course. And Grant actually goes on leave to go back to they thought he was going to die, so they summoned Grant. But by the time Grant got there, he recovered. And of course, then in the spring of 64, Grant is made lieutenant general. Fred accompanies him to Washington, and they share the quarters, Then Fred goes back to school, and the other brother comes. Fred's final time at the front is early in 65. He goes down to visit his father and his uncle Fred Dent, whom Grant has appointed to his staff and made him a general, actually. And so he gets it in his head that he wants to go fishing. So Grant's black valet, Batman, whatever you want to call him, a free man. He had not been a slave. Accompanies him, and they go fishing. They don't have any. Go duck hunting. They don't have any suitable weapons, so they just take a couple of ordinary army muskets, and they row out onto the Thames River. And what happens is the Navy patrol boat grabs them, thinking they're spies. So they literally were in danger of being hanged until they convinced these guys that they were not spies. And when Fred gets back to his dad makes a joke of it and says it says like, it would have been funny if you'd been hanged. All right, afterwards, Fred goes to West Point. He's peripherally involved in the hazing of I forget the young man's name now, but the first black cadet at West Point who never graduated. He's commissioned to the 4th Cavalry. He sees active service in the Bannocks and against the Bannocks, Comanches, and Apaches. He works for a little while as an engineer, railroad engineer. Then he's made aide-de-camp to Sherman. Sherman made a tour of Spain, Italy, southern France, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, Austria, Germany, back to France. And Fred was there. He later comes back, serves in the army. He's promoted rather ahead of schedule to lieutenant colonel staff. Now, promotions to staff were selective, so seniority didn't count. And was on leave as an aide-de-camp to his father during, after the father left the presidency. He made his world tour. Grant was immensely popular. He was received at European courts, Queen Victoria, went to Japan, I think, China. After that, he resigns he helps his father write his memoirs. He ends his business for a while, then helps his father write his memoirs, then goes back to business. He's living in New York at the end of, in 1898. And he returns to duty at the Army. He commands the 14th New York, which is a famous regiment. Its nickname is the 14th Brooklyn. I forget what its federal number is. It's still in the active armed forces. He was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. I think, was military governor of Puerto Rico, and he was on occupation duty for a while. With the war in the Philippines, he commanded a brigade, which included the 25th Infantry. And if this works, it may not work. It's not going to work. No, it's not going to work. Sorry. But if you write me, my email is anofi@aol. anofi@aol. I'll send you the link. There's actually a motion picture of Fred Grant leading the 25th Infantry Regiment. Okay. He rose to Major General in the post-war army as a regular. He died in 1912. He was still on active duty. He was commanding general of the Department of the East. In other words, he commanded half of the continental United States. He was the second highest ranking officer in the Army. All right. Now he had married this woman. This picture, of course, is when they're quite old. And she was quite wealthy. They had two children. The daughter married a Russian prince, and she wrote several books about what it was like to be a Russian princess. And they got out of Russia before the revolution. The son went to West Point, and that was U.S. Grant the third. Went to West Point, became an engineer. He graduated the same year Douglas MacArthur did. He was on the staff of the Supreme War Council in World War One. He converted the third floor of the White House into a proper, with an attic, into a proper floor. Done, by the way, with permission of Congress and financing from Congress. Although he didn't do a very good job, because the problem of the building was that the building was old and the foundations could no longer support the weight of a full floor, as Harry Truman found out one day when Margaret was playing the piano and the piano went through the floor. But during the Second World War, Ulysses Grant III was deputy director of National Civil Defense under Mayor LaGuardia. And then he was the first president of the Civil War Centennial Commission. He served for a couple of years. This is the book. There's lots of footnotes because there are things to explain that Fred mentions when he makes, he gets people's names wrong or he gets events somewhat incorrectly. He leaves dates out, things like that. And it's available from Savas Beatty. There is an audio edition and I don't know if it's a Kindle or some other version, but it's an e-edition, and it's available there. Any questions?